There's a whole lot going on inside our head that we don't understand. Don't feel bad about that. There are a lot of world-class experts that are just as puzzled about what makes the human brain tick. Bret Stetka tries to unravel what we actually do know in his new book called A History of the Human Brain, From the Sea Sponge to CRISPR, How Our Brain Evolved. Bret Stetka is editorial director at Medscape, the professional division of WebMD. He's also a contributor to NPR and Scientific American. I asked him why he took on the daunting task of trying to explain the human brain.
Well, I took on this project because I've been interested in the brain my whole life. I went to medical school and then didn't go into practice. I went into neuroscience research. And after publishing a few papers, fell into, I needed money. So I found a gig at WebMD, writing and editing mostly psychiatry and neurology content and covering medical news. I've always been a musician, and I really liked the creative aspect of being able to write about the medicine and the science that I love. It felt like a nice compromise for me. And 15 years later, I've managed to turn that into a career. So when I was approached about writing a book and whether or not I had any ideas, I said, I absolutely do not have any ideas. I don't even know where to start. But I just read a book on the heart. There were a couple of really great books on how we came to understand how the heart works. And I poked around, and no one had really ever done a layman's history of the human brain. So I said, what if we just look at where did the brain come from and where is it going? And do I regret going back 4 billion years to how life arose? Maybe a little bit. That's a broad scope, but it was fun to try to squeeze the entire history of the brain into 250 pages.
How unique is the human brain in nature?
It's certainly unique, but not nearly as unique as we thought for most of humanity. And I discovered this. I mean, of course, everyone knows that chimpanzees share 99% of our DNA and are incredibly smart. But, I hadn't really spent time observing chimps and bonobos, our other closest cousin. And if you spend an hour, I went to the San Diego Zoo early on in this research and spent about 3 hours observing bonobos, and just think of them as smaller chimps with funny hair. They are just incredibly human. They all have personalities. They use tools. They make tools, as Jane Goodall discovered in the 70s, maybe late 60s. Yeah, and I witnessed one incident. I don't think it's in the book. There was a little girl with a bottle of water who had walked up to the glass partition at the bonobo enclosure, and a young female bonobo came running over and started aggressively pointing at the bottle of water, and then with her hand kind of gestured for the little girl to move over a few feet. And then the bonobo pointed at a little hole in the partition, as if she wanted the girl to pour the water through the hole for her. And the whole thing was so human. It made me realize just, how close we are cognitively.
Well, that's been studied. You mentioned in the book something about the Great Ape Dictionary.
Yes, and that was developed by a team of researchers in Scotland, and they are trying to, I believe it's mostly in chimps so far, at least it was when I was researching, and they're discovering that chimpanzees have well over 100 or 150 gestures or sounds that have meaning. So a sort of proto-language. Stomping means something. Put their hand in the air means come over here. They have many different gestures when they're annoyed, for basically saying, please stop what you're doing. And they're trying to catalog all these. It's obviously hard. It's hard to do because a lot of these gestures are crude, but over time they're amassing data that chimps have an incredibly rich language and style of communication.
And to be clear, this is something they came up with on their own. This is not mimicking humans or something they're, a trick that they're taught.
Exactly. And that's a great point because as I'm sure in past decades, it was kind of trendy to teach Great Ape sign language and things like that. And at some point, the researchers started saying, well, look, this is fascinating. They can learn sign language, but what if we just studied how they're actually interacting with each other? It's a much more natural experiment, if you will. It's really just observation. And it turns out that, they can learn, some degree of sign language and things like that, but they actually have their own rich language that just completely evolved in them and probably in a shared ancestor that we both share from 7 million years ago or so.
Was there any special condition that existed in prehistoric Earth that gave the brain the conditions to evolve the way it did, the human brain?
Sure, there are many, and I kind of get into the different pillars of how our brain evolved. So just top level, I mean, our social lives were huge. Our eventually symbolic communication and taking gestures and hoots and hollers beyond that to actual language. Being omnivorous was huge, and later on, more recently, creativity. But really, the one of the big factors in why researchers think our brains just grew so much and got so complex was that due to climate shifts, we had been living in the trees 4 or 5 million years ago, and back then we would have been the Australopithecus or Australopithecines, our long distant ancestors that we eventually branched off of. But due to climate shifts, they ended up getting pushed out into the savanna of Africa, where they weren't at the top of the food chain like hominins or humans are now. There's no way a short chimp-looking man or woman is going to take down a lion on the savannah. So selection acted on different traits for us to survive, and that happened to be our intelligence. So, over time, selection favored those with larger, more complex brains. And then a big turning point was about 2 million years ago as Homo erectus, one of our long distant ancestors, arose. Their brain basically doubled in size relatively quickly on an evolutionary time scale, meaning still, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And they think that this was due to meat, to be honest. And this, I've heard this from many vegetarian scientists that say, well, we still have to admit that once we became good hunters and had reliable sources of calories and didn't have to forage all day, you fell an antelope, you had reliable food for days or weeks, especially once fire came along and you can preserve it. Your hands and your brain are freed up for other pursuits. So then selection can act on skills involved with things like tool making or weapon making and making fire. And so the thought is that it was just that reliable source of calories that let selection act on other traits that required a big brain. So over time, the brain got bigger and bigger and bigger, thanks to meat. And later on, seafood too is a big part of the story.
In fact, you started one of your chapters with this line: "Humans will eat just about anything within reason." I guess that was a good thing, wasn't it?
It was. Being omnivorous was one of the key pillars of our success, because even amongst hominins or other humans or humanoids, we eat anything compared to most species, except for your ravenous dogs and goats. We'll eat meat, we'll eat grasses, we'll eat vegetables. And so when Africa did experience these drastic climate shifts, which it did many times over the last couple million years, if the fruits in the forest dried up, we could access tubers and roots on the savanna, and vice versa. If the savanna dried up, we could relatively ably climb back into the trees and get fruit and eventually hunt and access fish from inland lakes. And then eventually, as I write, another proposed theory is that learning to track tides on the coast of southern Africa could have been really big, at least for a few populations of humans that nearly went extinct, because you can get about 3,500 calories an hour from tracking shellfish under optimal conditions. So that could have been a big role too. But it was really just omnivorism, just being able to enjoy a wide range of foods and nutrients.
Have human brains grown as large as they can possibly get in nature? I mean,
The,
as you say, they eventually have to come out of a woman.
Yeah, so that's the obstetric dilemma, they call it. Well, first of all, the interesting thing is that our brains have actually been shrinking for the last 20 or 30,000 years. And that's thought to be due to the fact that how the brain is wired and the connectivity amongst the neurons and the neural structure has become more important than overall size. So, like Neanderthals' brain was about 1700 cc's, ours now is about 1400, 1450. And back many hundreds of thousand years ago, our brain was 1700. So it has shrunk, but still, compared to most animals, most mammals even, our brain is huge. And right, so there are limits on the human birth canal. Thank God for so many women's sake. And so, sort of the evolutionary workaround to that was to have kids earlier and earlier in development when they're smaller. But the downside to that is that they are completely helpless, for years. Some would say into the college years, at least in my case.
Yeah.
The upside to that is, if as long as someone has parents or someone to care for them, that means they get years and years of this enriched environmental experience. They're being taught by their peers and their parents. They're taking in sights and sounds, and their brain is more pliable and neuroplastic, as they say, so it can take in all these experiences and build a richer, complex, conscious experience. So overall, it's a good thing. It's just a pain in the butt for modern parents.
Has the capacity to learn and just store data ever been measured?
It's incredibly hard to measure something like that.
I remember hearing that years ago that, humans only use about 10% of their brain and the rest is just there.
Yeah, that's a funny sort of fact for you. I mean, I've been taught that so many times over the years, and as far as I know, there's no evidence for it, and I don't know where it came from. If you scan a brain with a functional MRI, which sort of is a real-time MRI, most of the brain is active at during certain activities or certain parts of the day. So, perhaps, if you're sitting on the couch doing nothing, not thinking about anything, maybe at that time, maybe 10% is working or 20%, who knows, but you'd have to put someone under a scanner and sort of do a proportion of what's active. But really, if you're engaged in something, all sorts of brain regions are working together much of the time. So I don't think you can put a number on it, but I'd say most of the time it's far higher than 10. And we use all parts of our brain for something. So yeah, so that is a myth, but you do see it around. It's still out there.
Still to come, our conversation with Bret Stetka continues with another part of the history of the brain, the theory of mind. That's next on The Best of Our Knowledge. Got any questions or comments about The Best of Our Knowledge? Send them in. Our email address is knowledge@wamc.org. And if you'd like to listen to this or any past programs again, you can find them online at our flagship station's website. Just go to wamc.org and click on the programs link. And while you're there, subscribe to the Best of Our Knowledge's podcast or download the WAMC radio app to listen on demand, anytime, any place. This is The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Bob Barrett, and our guest today is Bret Stetka, editorial director at Medscape, the professional division of WebMD, and a contributor to NPR and Scientific American. We're talking about his new book called A History of the Human Brain, From the Sea Sponge to CRISPR, How Our Brain Evolved. As us humans get older, we reach the point where we realize we are not the center of the universe. This is called the theory of mind. I asked Stetka to explain what that means.
The theory of mind is the idea that an individual, a human or a chimp or an animal, has the appreciation that someone else has their own thoughts, opinions, and desires. I know that you have a different perspective on, what we're talking about than you do, but a dog would not have that ability. I know that if I leave the fridge open, my wife's going to be upset or something like that. And she's going to have a different emotion than me. And so the question has been, when does this arise in evolution? And there's been many studies in monkeys and chimps, and I think bonobos, trying to determine this. And it seems that chimps do have some degree and some awareness that other chimps and humans have their own individual thoughts and perspectives. So if you put food out, and they know that a human researcher can see that food and see the chimp, they won't run in and steal it. But if you block it so that human can't see it, they appear to know that the human can't see it, and they'll be willing to run in and get it. So it's sort of a primordial awareness that other entity sees and feels something different.
How much understanding do we have of brains that learn differently?
Yeah, I mean, the human brain is, compared to all other brains on Earth, including chimps and bonobos, we're all pretty similar cognitively. It's just sort of at that upper edge of the spectrum. Of course, there's variation. People learn differently. People have, some people are visual learners, some are auditory learners. So of course there are differences, and it really just comes down to the individual, what works for them, and that determines how their brain is wired. If someone's a visual learner, over time, the circuits that connect their memory centers, like the hippocampus, to their visual centers are probably a bit more connected than if someone's an auditory learner, in which case they'd be connected more to the auditory center. So there's this big complex network in the brain of many different centers, and just depending on your personality and your life influences are incredibly important. You will have literally a physically different brain, but overall, all of our brains are pretty similar.
Well, looking ahead, what is the future of this? I mean, there's genetic engineering. Are we going to go that route?
So in my subtitle, I mentioned CRISPR, which is sort of the genetic engineering technology that's gotten all the attention recently and is scared the hell out of a lot of people. But it's basically, we have the ability now, meaning geneticists, I certainly don't have this ability, to go in with this technology called CRISPR and literally edit the genome. So you can take a detrimental gene out, you can add a positive gene. So the good news is that doctors will be able to, say, use CRISPR to cure disorders in children or in embryos at the embryonic stage who may not make it past age 3 because they've got a genetic disorder caused by one gene. But kind of the worrisome side is, scientists will also be able to go in and insert desirable genes. So, the biggest fear is some mad scientist will get a hold of this technology and try to create super babies by inserting genes for intelligence and height and, name your trait, which is incredibly scary. And one scientist in China already did this in an embryo to prevent his twins from contracting HIV from their dad, who was HIV positive. And, in theory, that could be a great thing, but he did it without sort of the global network of ethical committees that are overseeing this. So I think it's going to be a long process. And I think that the conditions that people would want to use this for in that sense are so complex, like something like intelligence, and involve such a network of genes and environmental influences that it'll be decades before we get there. So I think for now, hopefully it'll be mainly used to treat disorders and improve people's lives and quality of life.
This is how we ended up with Khan in Star Trek. So no, that's not a good thing. Finally, say we had this conversation 100 years from now, would we still be studying this and learning new things about the brain?
I think definitely. The brain is, we don't understand, much of anything compared to any other organ. It's just so complicated. It's, as far as we know, the most complicated entity in the universe, except for perhaps the universe itself. And I think we'll made plenty of strides in understanding it. It may get a little bit science fiction when we start understanding, how you drop consciousness and sort of what we've always called, a soul and a being. Like when you start applying science to that, it gets a little dicey, but I think that will happen to some degree. And I think, it's fascinating, and it's just so hard to say because science moves so quickly, and it will depend on how genetic engineering evolves. You could certainly envision a scenario where we artificially evolve our brain, and then the collective genome changes over time to the point where we literally have different brains. But I don't think they would be all that different. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Again, the name of Bret Stetka's new book is A History of the Human Brain, From the Sea Sponge to CRISPR, How Our Brain Evolved. Leaders at West Point will allow most of the students involved in a major cheating scandal to remain at the military academy. Late last year, 73 cadets were accused of collaborating on a virtual calculus exam. The scandal is raising questions about honor among the men and women who will become the Army's future leaders. Desiree Diorio reports for the American Homefront Project.
More than 50 of the accused cadets admitted they cheated, but almost all of them will get a second chance. West Point enrolled them in a special program designed to rehabilitate students who violate the honor code. Shortly after the scandal became public last year, 4 cadets resigned from the academy. Another 8 could face tougher discipline. West Point Superintendent Darrell Williams addressed the scandal at a congressional hearing this month. He defended the academy's decision to allow most of the cadets to stay.
There's no excuse for violating United States Military Academy Honor Code, and I have all the tools I need to hold them accountable for that, and we will.
Those tools, like the rehabilitation program, came about the last time a large cheating scandal rocked the academy, 1976. Back then, the accused cheaters were kicked out, and the Army established a special commission to investigate. Craig Bruce Smith teaches military history at the Army School of Advanced Military Studies. He says the aftermath of 1976 is when West Point began to reassess what honor and the honor code really mean.
Honor was understood pretty widely throughout society in the 18th into the 19th century, but it's very much faded from public discourse, public discussion in the 20th, 21st century. So how the honor code has been administered has changed greatly.
Smith, speaking personally and not on behalf of the Army, says the Academy began to allow more discretion in punishing honor code violations after the 1976 scandal.
So rather than a black and white, if you have broken this, you are removed, that there should be an ability to assess the situation, the circumstances, and to have a response that is not all or nothing.
That's been the trend throughout higher education. At non-military colleges, rehabilitation approaches, like the kind at West Point, are much more common than outright dismissal when it comes to academic dishonesty. David Rettinger is the former head of the International Center for Academic Integrity.
Expulsion flies in the face of everything we understand about the psychology of ethical and moral behavior.
That's partly because the section of the brain that makes you feel icky when you do something wrong isn't fully developed until around age 23 to 26, after college is over. Rettinger says rehabilitation seems in line with West Point's mission to instill the values of duty, honor, and country.
That doesn't necessarily mean weeding people out who are imperfect, because we're all imperfect. That means taking the best cadets we can and turning them into the best officers they can be, which means teaching them. And if there's no opportunity for redemption, what are we really teaching them?
But Congresswoman Jackie Speer of California, who chairs the Military Personnel Subcommittee, says cadets accepted into elite military academies should be held to a higher standard.
I want to see accountability that I, frankly, am very disappointed does not exist in the academies right now. When you have, etched in the marble at West Point, a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. That should be crystal clear.
West Point leaders called the cheating extremely disappointing. But speaking to the Congressional Committee, Superintendent Williams also noted the cadets faced an unusual situation during the pandemic.
Our young men and women were in a remote learning environment. Some were challenged in terms of home life at home. They were away from their coaches, their teachers, and the structures that provide the way ahead.
Williams promised that the cadets will learn from this experience. I'm Desiree Diorio on Long Island.
Scientists can be brilliant when they research new ideas and come up with innovative solutions to problems. When it comes to communicating their work to people like you and me, they could use some work. That's the topic of today's Academic Minute.
There are many challenges in breaking down science for consumption. I'm Dr. Lynn Pascarella, president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And today on the Academic Minute, Laura Gurton, professor of earth science at Penn State Brandywine, details a solution.
Science is a communication challenge. Scientists are trained and successful in sharing their research results in professional peer-reviewed journals. But the general population does not have access to these publications. Or if they do, they are left scratching their heads trying to figure out what was done and why it matters. To broaden the reach of sharing scientific accomplishments, scientists need to focus on telling stories and using tools to communicate those stories, such as art. I use quilts to tell stories of science. You may not think of pairing science and quilts together, but showcasing a science narrative in a quilt immediately provides a welcoming visual to invite the viewer to explore fabrics and patterns as they are laid out in the display. As one learns the story presented in a quilt, I have found they want to share their own quilt or blanket story. Everyone has a favorite blanket. And then take the information they have just learned and pass it along to others, thereby engaging in the most important step all individuals can take when it comes to building science literacy, just to start talking about science. I have seen this several times when I have displayed quilts from my collection, Stitching Hope for the Louisiana Coast. These quilts are based upon stories of adaptation and resilience shown by residents in southern Louisiana, an area that is known for its doom and gloom stories, from sea level rise, habitat degradation, and impacts from more intense hurricanes year after year. Each quilt contains one success story that is told through panels of fabric across the creative work. Scientists and non-scientists alike are able to share, to teach, to learn, and to, importantly, communicate not just the what of scientific research, but why the research matters and how it benefits society.
That was Laura Gurton of Penn State Brandywine. You can find this, other segments, and more information about the professors at academicminute.org.
The Academic Minute is a production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio, in partnership with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. That's all the time we have for this week's program. If you'd like to listen again, join us online at our flagship station's website. Go to WAMC.org and click on the programs link. While you're there, subscribe to our podcast or any of the other WAMC or National Productions podcasts. And if you have any questions or comments about the program, send them in. Our email address is knowledge@WAMC.org. And you can find us on Twitter at TBOO Knowledge. I'm Bob Barrett. Be sure to join us next time for another edition of The Best of Our Knowledge.
Bob Barrett is producer of The Best of Our Knowledge. Dr. Alan Chartock is executive producer. The Best of Our Knowledge is a production of WAMC Radio's National Productions, which is solely responsible for its content. Hear more at WAMC.org.